Uh, Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The What's Within Us podcast. I'm your host, Jacobovits. A pleasure to have all of you guys listen to another amazing episode. We have with us here Ari Jacobovits, incredible individual. I got to meet through the wife, but that's another story. But it's an honor to have you, Ari. Ari is one of a kind, just based on conversations I have with entrepreneurs that he has worked with at MIT. At the moment, he's the managing director of the MIT Africa program, and I think he has traveled to many countries across Africa, supporting MIT student-led businesses. This includes alumni as well. And I will just give it to Ari to just give us a rundown of the amazing projects he does through the MIT Africa program. But I think one thing I would just echo is that he has been there for over 6 years from what I can get online. MIT Africa is, I think, is one of those spaces where MIT students have that ability to really have the support and also the finance and just the network that I think is critical for it. But I won't take that away from Ari, because Ari is the person who really leads these programs. So Ari, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you. If before we get into the MIT Africa program, and there are many other amazing things you've done. You work for Jumia Group as an operational management intern. You work for the U.S. Department of State. You worked at a small enterprise development in Crowley Community Marine Park, and many other amazing projects I work with. But for everyone on the podcast, just get a sense of who you are. Can you just please tell us first, how was it like? Let's take it back to the beginning, back to the Fletcher School of Tufts University. How did you get in there? And why did you pick that school to study international business, development, economics, and strategy?
Well, thanks, Jacob. Very happy to join you here. And you're very kind with your words. It's cool to talk to somebody. Part of our name is the same. The beginning of my last name and your first name. So some kinship already. So it's hard to sort of talk about how I ended up there without kind of starting from the beginning.
Yep.
So let me just start there briefly to give just a sense of my background, because I think it's an important piece of it in a way. So I'm not African. I don't have any African heritage that I know of, at least in the last 500 years.
That's so funny.
So I checked the genetic data, I am first generation American. My parents emigrated here from Romania, and I grew up in a very international community, very diverse community in the Washington, D.C. area in Maryland. And because of my own family background and the people I grew up with and in my neighborhood, I always had this very sort of internationally oriented kind of curiosity. I think that was nurtured by all the people around me and the people I was meeting. And I always loved maps and things like that. Another thing I always loved growing up was music.
Mm-hmm.
And a big part of my life, in terms of what I spent a lot of time doing, was in bands and studied music, and just in general, always loved it. And I credit music as my kind of pathway to where I am today, in terms of becoming really interested in African studies and just say African affairs in general. So when I was at university, I went to Indiana University, which has a pretty well-known music school. And I mean, it's a large state university, so there are a lot of things there. So I did a joint journalism and music program, and I took a history of jazz course from a quite famous professor who really invented this field of jazz studies, not necessarily like there's the jazz, there's like the music itself, but then there's like jazz studies, which is then a historical, social, ethnological view. And when you took his class, his name was David Baker. He's passed now, but he was very, very influential academic and musician. And when
Are we name dropping already?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
right. I mean, you can look him up. He's a very interesting story, but he's just a professor that I had. It's not someone that I would knew really. There was many people in his class, and when he taught history of jazz, he began it really, in Africa, frankly, and it really was my first exposure to the ways in which African culture, African society, African knowledge influenced what America has become. And of course, it's not like something I never thought about at all, but like from an intellectual level, like that was really my first exposure to it. And I think that set me down this path that was sort of just mostly led by curiosity.
Yep.
And it led me to spending in my college years, I spent a semester at the University of Cape Town, where I took a lot of African studies courses very intentionally, and was fascinated there too about confronting the fact of how little I knew about African history growing up in the US. Now I look at it and think to myself, like, well, why did I know so little? Who did it suit that I knew so little? Why is it, people of African heritage make up a very large percentage of the US population, one of the largest demographic groups, in terms of just ethnic background, not even talking about specific countries where people are from, but it was the fact that I knew so little that made me so curious to learn more. So there are various things that I did after that, and we can talk about it. But after spending a number of years, first in Peace Corps in Kenya, and then working with the State Department's refugee program in many African countries, I got a little bit of this bug of sort of, okay, well, what are these opportunities that are in front of us? What's the sort of intersection of African studies, business, and technology that I'm sort of seeing around me? And, I think living in Kenya, I think Kenya is just a buzz with innovation and entrepreneurship. And so being there, I think, was also just incredibly influential in that sense too. So I started looking around for graduate programs that I felt like could really encapsulate my broad interest areas. And the fact that I was somewhat of an unconventional candidate for a typical business, like MBA type of program. And I know that because I went and visited many of them. And, at each of them, I talked about my Africa interests and stuff like that. And mostly people kind of just looked at me a little bit like, oh, I don't know what to tell you. And I'd say, this was some years back. Nowadays, I think, just looking at what's happening at Sloan, I think there's so much Africa interest there. It's almost like there's way more demand than there's supply of opportunities. So what am I going to say?
Tufts, how did Tufts
Oh
get
yeah, so I went and visited Fletcher. I actually had a friend that went there, and it was like sort of this like funny stroke of good luck where like the day I was visiting, they had this event on internships in Africa. I was like, oh, well, how
Uh,
about that? You know, not only I just happened to walk into this thing that's happening here, and all these students were sitting around and talking about things that they were doing. And there was one guy who worked at an energy company in Somaliland, and I was like, okay, wow. So there are people here that are like doing really, really interesting things. And uh, ultimately, that was like really my motivation. So of course, there was no guarantee with your application and admission, but it all worked out, and I decided to go. Plus, the program itself is very unique and interdisciplinary. And if I didn't do that, I probably would have gone and done like a joint, like MBA, MA kind of like program that would have cost a lot more money and been like a 3-year thing
mhm.
instead of, you know, the opportunity that I had at Fletcher, the scholarship that I had, and also you know, the fact that it was only 2 years. So yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. And it's a great it's like it has come full circle. Being part of walking into Tufts for an African internship event. And now you provide internships to
Right. Yeah. It's
or
pretty,
MIT. It's
yeah.
a quick one. How did so did you did music? I know you met this incredible professor taking this course. How did you see any correlation between music and international business? Or did
I
you
mean,
make kind
not, yeah, not in any kind of direct way. I would say I was not really thinking that much about business probably until much later.
yep.
You know, I was very like kind of a high-minded person. You know, I was the kind of student that like when I was an undergraduate laughed at the business majors for being so, you know, so serious and not very fun. And it's like,
Yeah.
why, I making like I didn't think of their interests as very like intellectual and like super interesting. Um, and anyway, there's
Yep.
something to be said about that. But I uh, I ended up coming to it frankly through some of the work that I had been doing before, like after I graduated school. You know, realized that if you want a job, you know, there's a very good chance it's going to be with a business of some kind.
Mhm.
Um, and then also seeing what enterprise development could do for people
Yep.
um, in the context of an African country. And I think that latter part was really what turned me on to it. How just being able to have a predictable income month to month, even if it's small, the fact that it exists
Mhm.
and you can plan around it really is such a stabilizing thing in someone's life,
Yep.
and seeing what the possibilities are in that domain.
Yep. Agreed. Agreed. So I think so. I mean, I just checked recently. I think you worked for Zipcar at that time. I think it was an innovative company, and it still is. I mean, I think it's pre-Uber, right? Um,
Yeah, I think Uber probably took a lot of their market share away.
I bring this up because you work with entrepreneurs, and we're gonna get into MITST. I think it's the MIT Africa program. Um, But you have this entrepreneurial experience. You worked as a marketing intern, I think, or you work in marketing in
Yeah,
that.
I was doing a lot of marketing and sales for them. And
Yes.
I mean, at the time, it was a pretty young company. I was in their DC office. Their headquarters is here in Boston because has an MIT founder. So that's also kind of funny how that ended up happening. But I would say that my whole life, you know, I was always just very excited about new ideas, new approaches to solving sort of problems and challenges, just in all senses. Like I I think I probably got a bit of that just from my dad,
Mm,
who um, you know, he used to always sit with us and watch like science documentaries. So I really developed an appreciation and love of science and math, which is funny because I never really thought that I was very good at it. But even to this day, you know, like I would say I still love it. And I do a lot of work on its periphery, just not exactly that itself.
Yep.
But you know, shout out to PBS and the Nova series for just like turning so many young people onto these really interesting things. So you're seeing the most innovative, newest ideas being presented there, and like, you know, so I always had that sort of framing, I would say.
Yep.
And my dad himself was a scientist. He studied physics and worked in the tech space, so he probably wished I would have done that. But who would have thought that this career in African affairs would have led me to a place like MIT? I mean, I don't think he would have ever imagined it. I probably couldn't have either, but I always told him, don't worry, it'll be fine.
No, I mean, shout out to your dad. And I think, you know, I think what you do, you create really amazing possibilities, opportunities, as well as you create new platforms that has a huge impact on future generations, not just of MIT students in their education, but also to Africans at the moment in 2023 and beyond. And it has a huge impact consequentially on how the world is going to be in the next 20 or 30 years based on Africa's positioning in the world economic just advancement and development as the hotbed of most innovations at this point. For us to kind of, because the essence of it, just to learn more about the incredible work you're doing at MIT Africa program. I know in the earlier conversation we had, you talked about various amazing program opportunities that you facilitate. You have internships for MIT, international internship programs that provides one-on-one, one-of-a-kind, world-class experience for MIT students. There's a global teaching lab that synthesizes current teachings. You work with teams, communicate with your peers on different cultural backgrounds. You share MIT unique approach with high school students around the world. There is a global seed funds. This is a very interesting one. Gives students the support that they need. Foundation for Research and Education between MIT and African collaborators. Then there's study abroad as well. Pre-departure learning, the affiliated degree programs. There's so many things that you do. Can you just give us first how you kind of, I know I've kind of touched it, but how did you end up at MIT? And how has the MIT Africa program evolved to the point where now you have this many programs that you facilitate?
Yeah. So to answer your first question, how I came to MIT, I honestly don't have a very exciting story. I finished my degree, my master's degree at Fletcher, and my wife, well, was the woman who's now my wife. At the time we weren't married yet. We basically had, you know, she was in a graduate program at Harvard at the time. And the deal we had was like, okay, well, whoever gets a job first somewhere, like that's where we're gonna live, and we'll figure it out from there. And so we kind of were in this phase of searching around, and we spent some time back in DC. Anyway, and then she got an offer to work for the city of Boston as an urban planner. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess we're staying in Boston. So then it was up to me to sort of figure out how I was gonna take my experience, my degree, and parlay that into the job opportunities that are available in this city. And it wasn't very clear to me at first. I mean, I think I was interviewing at a lot of different tech companies in the area for different kinds of roles, but I I would always, like, it's so funny, like in hindsight, I would always talk about in the interviews with like these recruiters who had no idea what I was talking about, how like, oh, like I'm thinking about the applications of this technology in sort of like these different contexts, and like, you know, my background experience. And, you know, they were not trying to hear any of that, but like even in the interviews, I'd always go and like talk about that. And frankly, it just like didn't go that well for me. And I couldn't help it. Like that's where my mind was, and that's what was interesting me and motivating me. And then at some point, I just saw this position open. I was searching for opportunities all the time. I saw it open at MIT, and I applied. And I went in with the sort of the same strategy of like talking about applications of technologies, and finally found an audience for that kind of talk. and where instead of people were looking at me like, what are you talking about, I got more like, oh, that's interesting, tell us more.
Mm.
And yeah, so really just like went through the process. I had sort of I come to realize that a lot of the things that I hope to do uh, while living in Boston, a lot of them would be connected to universities in some way. So I had started looking more and more at universities for opportunities, and I had been connected to another group at MIT called the D Lab, which is kind of like an appropriate technologies group, and was just volunteering for them. But there had been an Africa program in my current department, but it was pretty, I don't know, it was just sort of nascent. Like it wasn't I wouldn't say nothing like exciting to really say too much about. Not to like bash my predecessor or anything, but like I didn't even know about it, until this job like came up. So that's it. So then I was offered the position, I took it, and been steering it ever since. And I guess now I'll answer your other question. So honestly, I really, a lot of the success I've had, I owe to all the people around me and the department that I'm in, for giving me the space to define what we wanted to do and be creative about it. So just to give a sense of that, so the program itself lives within MIT's Center for International Studies. The Center for International Studies at MIT, I often describe as like MIT's like Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's an interesting organization within MIT that does a lot of different things. And we have a particular division where these specific country and area studies programs live. It's called MISTI, which is MIT International Science and Technology Initiatives. I don't know if anybody at MIT knows that. They just call it MISTI. So that's what it is. And so I have my colleagues that are working across many different countries. So Europe and Asia and Latin America, Oceania, and I'm leading our Africa programs in that sense. So, and there are many things that we do, like similar things that we do, but I think we all have a sort of a toolkit that we use to sort of apply in different ways that make sense for our region or things that just are interesting or exciting to us. So, across the board, I would say our group does things in 3 different categories. So category 1 would be student-focused activities and programs. And like category 2 is researcher and faculty-focused activities and programs. And category 3 is community oriented. So that could be conferences and events that are open to the public or not. It could be supporting different classes that are happening in some way. And other things that we do that might not easily fit into one of the other categories. So that first bucket of the student-focused activities, really our whole division got started with student internships. This was actually 1980 with the Japan program. I think it's an important note here, actually. Let me just put a side note in that's important, that whereas in like a lot of places you might find that Africa programs emerge out of a something focused on international development, social economic empowerment, what have you. This was never the case. It was like the program itself was always more oriented towards industry.
Mm.
And at some point, there's a professor from South Africa at MIT that in, I think, 2013 was like, how come we don't have any Africa related thing in this group? I think it's about time. And I think in our roots, we were never a development program. And I think that's a key thing to note, is that that was never sort of part of our foundational mission.
Mm.
I think, frankly, has really allowed us to be much more creative and free in terms of what we think we could be doing. It really has opened my eyes into a lot of different kinds of ways to engage in Africa that I think are missed opportunities in other places. So I'll just leave that there. So internships. Students are mostly going to private sector and academia sector kind of groups, and often they are engaged in the private sector, companies that are very oriented towards R&D and that kind of like value creation. We have a strong research strong research ethos and enterprise at MIT. It's a big part of the student experience to participate in it. And of course, it's a well-known research university. So we try to take those things that we do best and just find partners that also are doing those things at their best. And we kind of just, merge in that way. When our students are doing internships at the academic sector, they're working on research in labs at African universities.
Yep.
And so a big part of my job is going and finding the most interesting things that are going on. Yep. And just sort of like keeping my eyes and ears open for those things, because, frankly, MIT students have a lot of opportunities that are being thrown at them. Probably some of the most fertile ground, probably, from any university in the world. I mean, I can't imagine many other schools are like this. Certainly in the domain of like science and engineering and that stuff. So you have to always be on your game, and if you want students to come, you have to be thinking about what is interesting, what is exciting. And fortunately, that is just what I am naturally doing and drawn towards. So spending a lot of time doing that, and there are a lot of students that go and they do it. The other big program we have for students is the teaching labs, global teaching labs. So this happens every January, so I'm currently quite busy with planning them. But they're fundamentally STEM education workshops for high school students that are taught by MIT students. And so across the world, they take all kinds of different shapes and sizes and flavors. One of the main focus areas that I've had when it comes to Africa is working with African Math Olympiad teams. So the International Math Olympiad, big math competition that happens every year. Of course, there are the legacy countries that always dominate. China does very well, US does very well, Russia does very well. Strong culture of math in a lot of these places. But the students that participate in these programs and do very well and go on and get medals at the international competition are involved in so many amazing things down the line. It really is, these are like frontline innovators, because the math itself is hard, but it's not like higher level math. It's not like linear algebra or like advanced calculus or anything like that. It's math that you basically learn in high school, and just asking people questions in very, very tricky ways. Yep. You can go on the International Math Olympiad website and see some of the questions. So it is using math to basically develop incredibly strong problem-solving skills. And I thought that was a very exciting opportunity, and I know that MIT really values that kind of experience when it comes to undergraduate admissions, especially international undergraduate admissions, because it is a test that's the same every year. I mean, sorry, it's not the same every year. It's the same test for the entire world at this competition, and students can take it in their own language. So it's very much a standard setting mechanism in a way that's less culturally biased than standardized tests and things like that. And you can take it in your own language. So it sort of like brings people's names to the fore who are showing a lot of talent and promise in this kind of work. And I've noticed that a lot of international students at MIT it's very hard to get in for as an undergraduate. It's probably like 1% or less, whereas like maybe standard domestic is like maybe 3% or something.
Yep.
But the students who do come have a lot of experience in this work oftentimes. I came to learn that more and more African countries were preparing and training teams to go and compete. And not just that, but there are Pan-African Math Olympiads that happen every year. And within particular countries, they have more regional and country level competitions. And there isn't, because it's a new thing for a lot of these countries, not a high level of institutional knowledge in terms of how to prepare, because you have very accomplished African math professors that are coaching these teams. The problem is that that's not necessarily a skill set you need to have. You need to have a very particular skill set around these kinds of problems and the way that they're asked and the way you have to break them down. Not sort of like very high level theoretical, PhD level math. And we're lucky at MIT that we probably have a higher concentration of people that have excelled in this work than maybe any other school in the world. And so the idea is getting them out back into the world to contribute their knowledge to places that are ready to receive that knowledge. So anyway, that's a long way to talk about the math program, but it's been very exciting and interesting because we've worked with students that are now roaming the halls of MIT as undergraduates. It has been a really exciting way to get otherwise very, very bookish math students, like math majors, to an African country and like engaging and becoming interested in this whole world of stuff that they had no previous experience with. Anyway, been great. And of course we have other teaching labs, on other topics. Like I'm doing another one focused on really a 360-degree view of different renewable energy topics in science, related to science and engineering and even business. So yeah, big thing. And then we do have some study abroad programs. Study abroad is an interesting one. It's actually not something that started in our department, but we did inherit it. And it's not as huge of a thing at MIT. I think students are less likely to want to spend a semester at another school for a variety of reasons. But it's not that they don't do it. I think when they do go, they often spend time at some of the very well-known UK universities or Asian universities or other ones in Europe. And we do have some exchange programs where students will come to MIT that are very competitive. They'll come and spend a semester or a year with us too. So we currently have an agreement with University of Pretoria, which is a very, very strong engineering program, specifically in mechanical engineering and aero and astro engineering. Yeah, so like over the course of the year, I would say maybe 80 to 100 students participate in one of our programs. And I should say, it's open to anyone at MIT, so that's any student at any level in any field of study.
Yep.
And fundamentally, the idea is we are the Center for International Studies. Our mission is applied international studies. So like you're working in your field, which is not going to be international studies because we don't offer that major at MIT.
Yep.
You're working in your field, but we can create a way for you to learn about the history of the culture and society of that place that you're going, learn more and understand more about the context while you're doing your work. And so we orient programming around that. And I think it allows students to sort of come back with a more, with a greater appreciation of having a human-centered approach to making sure that they're thinking about what am I doing and what's going to be the impact. And in addition to that, what I love talking about with students when they come back is, okay, so you did you did some engineering project in, let's say, I don't know, Zambia. Okay, you were in Zambia, you were doing this engineering project. Aside from the engineering project itself, with whatever company or university you're working with, how did being in Zambia make you a better engineer or scientist? I think that's the key thing you want to know from these experiences. And we work with a lot of different partners, so I think a lot about how to sort of steer and position programs and placements around, I think, key objectives in African affairs more broadly.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that, and it gives the audience an idea of the different ways that MIT students engage outside of MIT. I'm sure some are in higher demand than others relatively to just if it fits in a specific need on average of MIT students. But from the global teaching labs to the study abroad to the internships, I do know that there is an output that is very impactful and meaningful. To this question I'm about to ask, how has sending the students out to do internships, for example, what has been the most gratifying moment for you? You have been at MIT for 6 years. You probably kind of built some of these programs in terms of operations, especially when we talk about study abroad, which in some sense is not heavily over-indexed when it comes to students being participants. But I'm sure there are some incredible stories that our audience would love to hear that makes you sleep well at night or get up in the morning.
Yeah.
Mind sharing some?
So one of the things is, I spend a lot of time also raising funds to be able to offer these programs at no cost to the student. So none of our students in any of our programs at anywhere in the world pay to be part of it. It's all offered on a cost control basis. So that money has to come from somewhere. There is some money within our headquarters that we all raise and sort of contribute that has, allowed us to do that. There's stuff that I specifically go out and raise specifically for Africa stuff. And so that means one of the things that I like about that and the liberating aspect of coming with your own funds, if you have them, is that you don't have to just do the standard things like where business is, right? Like, what are the big industries that could afford to bring over maybe a student from MIT in Africa? Oil and gas, no one's interested in that. Mining, probably not. Finance and banking, okay, maybe. Telecommunications, possibly we're getting there now. Yeah. Media, okay, possibly, if that's a good fit. But what the big topics and the global challenges of the world right now, at least as we've decide to focus on them at MIT, we picked AI, climate, and health. Finding the most interesting, difficult problems there and plugging students into work and those things, that is ultimately the most interesting thing. So in terms of gratifying things, there are students that I think go and have this experience, and almost like what happened to me is that totally changes their trajectory. Like they had been planning on doing this one thing and now they're doing a totally other thing, different thing. And it's now going to be a part of their life and change their trajectory, right? And I can think of several students that have specifically mentioned things like that. And I also think one of the really great things is just the impact we can have on the particular organizations. So when we have students that go, we don't like say, hey, our student is going to come and do this. I mean, it's just very much defined by what the organization wants, what projects they have and how we can plug in. So, I've had organizations tell me like, look, we would not be where we are today if not for the students that came. I've had several people tell me that, especially with like, startups that are relatively new, trying to do something pretty innovative and just operating in a difficult place. They're getting access to talent and networks that, are not affordable otherwise and not very accessible. So that to me is gratifying, is basically like being able to not have to necessarily go where like just the money is, because the money is not necessarily in a good place oftentimes. Yeah, it can be, but certainly like what the legacy industries, there's a lot more interesting and innovative stuff that can be done. And then we also have been experimenting with something new that I'd really like to expand, which is in the context of university-based research internships. That's where we've started doing this, where when an MIT student goes to a lab at a university, let's say they go to, as an example, what schools have we worked with recently?
In Africa?
What?
You mean schools in Africa?
Yeah, schools in Africa, like Ashesi University in Ghana.
Yeah,
Whatever. Just
yes.
We work with them. So, when they go, they go there, and they're attached to a professor in a lab doing research, that is getting done there. But we, in addition to funding our student going, we've now been able to raise funds so that we send additional funds to the hosting lab so that they can hire one of their own students to then be a part of the research project as well.
Incredible.
And so it's something I call co-mentorship, which is essentially MIT students will come, they probably have really, really strong technical skills, but contextually, they're new, they're novice. On the other hand, the students that are there have the context. And so that is a way that sort of interact and engage around research projects. And it's something I really like to expand more, particularly within startups, where we kind of are using our power to sort of keep the door open behind us so that other people can come in. And, because we might work with a company once and not come back not for any particular reason, just because there are a lot of things going on. But if a local student can then also be interning, you've now basically created a really important pipeline there.
Yep. And
we've helped subsidize that experience for people. And it's so interesting because even I was on a call earlier today about I'll protect this person's identity. Let's say somebody has a problem they're trying to solve in a particular country. That's, let's say, a mechanical engineering problem, very specific. And their inclination was to come to us, which is fine. And I asked, okay, have you talked to any of the local universities just in the area there about engaging them? And he was like, oh man, I didn't even think about that. So I was like, so what we could do is we could actually partner with them and come together.
Yep.
And I think that's just like a better way of doing things. It brings key people into the equation that might not have been there in the first place. And is just overall adding to, I think, really important knowledge production that's happening.
Exactly.
I think that is like, that to me has been very rewarding.
Yep.
About creating opportunities. And I don't even meet these students that come. Like I rarely even see them. I don't even know. I might know their names, but giving them that experience and that exposure that might not otherwise exist, I think is awesome. I really love being able to do that.
That's so incredible. So co-mentorship for this kind of new initiative for research-based, interns for research organizations, predominantly in, reputable institutions like Asahi. You mentioned University of Pretoria, perhaps, University of Africa Leadership University, I guess. Having those relationships, I think, is critical. I think everything you mentioned is very valuable, and I think for us, kind of close out is, you have been working on this multiple programs for 6 years. You started off maybe a decade before. You had maybe no idea of what Africa was. Now I can consider you an expert in Africa. What do you see as the future of Africa in terms of entrepreneurship, innovation?
Oh, well, that's a heavy one. Okay, honestly, I don't know, but let me tell you what I'm working towards. I think you have opportunities really in any domain. I think it's just a matter of where you are, what country you're in, what you have around you, and I think when you look at when you just hit fast forward to 2100, most of the other continents are basically, the population is roughly where it is now. Marginal changes up or down. But in Africa, there are 2.5 billion more people, which is crazy. I mean, this is like a huge population growth that's coming. It's hard to even imagine what that will look like and what that will mean. But if those projections hold true, then what Africa does is extremely consequential. And in addition to that, especially in the domain of education, what Africa does is extremely consequential. And I talk to a lot of these universities about, like, there are so many young people that are going to be coming through these places, like, and you're responsible for educating all of them. What you do matters so much. It's like, these teachers in African schools, probably, as they are in many places, under-resourced, maybe don't feel like people care enough about what they're doing or whatever. But their jobs are one of the most consequential and important jobs in the world, and people might not see that, but when you fast forward, it's like the future of the world, as it progressively becomes more and more African, what people are learning and how they're implementing that knowledge really, really will impact the trajectory of the entire planet.
Exactly.
So in the domain of education, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to be done, and frankly just needs to be done. How do you get higher quality education to more people faster, more efficiently? This is this is a global challenge we all need to solve, and I think it's particularly salient in Africa. Yep. And it's particularly consequential.
Yep.
And I think connected to that is something that I've been really focused on, which is deep tech. Let me just say deep tech. And I think it has a lot of, how you might interpret it. But let's just say tech that is heavily based on R&D that solves critical challenges, right? Not the latest app or random fintech thing, not to say that's not important, but really, really difficult challenges to solve. And I've engaged in some other projects that are around this, but I think that's it. And the powers of the world, I think we're able to use the resources that they gather exploitatively or not exploitatively to create R&D enterprises, essentially. Yep. And that's why they're wealthy countries in many ways. That's a gross oversimplification. But there's a reason that all these products and services are being innovated in some places and not others. And so I think we have to get to a point where that kind of knowledge creation is happening in Africa. And I think in pre-colonial times, there are very interesting examples of that. And so I think just getting back to that is so critical. And so I think so much of it is like connected to education fundamentally. But what I'm excited is to see really truly new like cases of intellectual property that are being developed in these countries, and businesses are being spun out. And you know, more and more people are getting hired by these industries and these companies. I think that to me is an exciting future. And it's a weird that it's taken so long. I mean, I think the way the Western world, the sort of, or like the developed world, so to speak, has engaged with Africa has been oriented towards poverty alleviation, you know, always. That's been where everyone's been focused, because it's much easier to notice like material lacking than it is to notice like rich cultural context.
Yep.
And I think it's always just everybody just sort of goes in that direction. And it's not like that's not important. I think people that are living in very dire financial circumstances need to be assisted in some way.
Yep.
But like that often it crowds out what else really has always needed to happen, which is working with Africa's most talented, innovative leaders and empowering them to really, really develop businesses, intellectual property on the ground. And it feels like nobody was properly focused on that in the past. Like all this aid money and all this sort of stuff. Like, yeah, like of course, like, you know, there's something there to be done. But ultimately, the only people that can solve that problem are the people in the countries themselves. I don't think, like, clearly, like, if we could have solved the problem, certainly, like, we would have solved it by now with all the, I don't know how many billions of dollars have been thrown at it. But what we do know is how to create really, really great research-driven enterprises with very, very smart people. And that is not necessarily that's something the West can be a part of in a much more productive way.
Yep.
And I guess that's kind of like how I'm thinking about it. So take the best institutions, partner with the best institutions there, and do your best work. Everyone brings their best. And I think that's what the Math Olympiad thing is about. And focus on excellence. Like everything you do in Africa, it should be focused on excellence.
Okay.
Achieving higher, not just allowing it to sort of like be this thing where throwing a few bones to people so that they don't so they have, anyway, I don't know what I'm saying. I'll cut that out.
Oh, of course. No,
Yeah.
I get your point, and I think that's a very good way to close out, because beyond anything else is like the local development of the research education institutions to acknowledge and kind of value the cultural context of what it means to build intellectual property in technical terms, but a kind of indigenous knowledge can be democratized, but also placed in a global front that they do get the acknowledgement and the credit on terms of economic profitability.
Yeah.
That is well deserved and well earned.
And, you know, and just to give an example, like that's happened. So one of the things that's so frustrating about this whole history is that when you look at the early American economy, it was an agrarian economy. And of course, there was the transatlantic slave trade,
Yep.
which I think when people think of it, like in, you know, in maybe the sort of mainstream terms, they think of Africans that were enslaved and forced to do labor in the quote unquote New World. And yeah, that was a big part of it. But the same side of that coin is the theft of intellectual property. Like the people that were growing these crops knew how to grow these crops. Like it was, seeds were isolated by geneticists essentially. I don't know what they would have been called at that point, or even if they even knew they were, geneticists in terms of microbiology, if they had that sense of it. But they were able to isolate certain strains and seeds and plants, and understood, had a certain understanding of agricultural technologies that they were able then to implement in the New World, that became the basis of the early American economy.
Exactly.
And it's very hard to separate the knowledge of Africans from the early American economy. Forget about the enforced labor. Obviously, that's important, but it's not the whole story.
Exactly.
And so the world has already benefited so much off of this knowledge. I think now it's basically time for Africa itself to benefit from that knowledge.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That's great history to always look back and see something has been done before. It's not a new challenge. Ari, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure everyone learned a lot from not just your knowledge of how you think about Africa as of 2023, but how consequential your role is at MIT, not just in Africa, but because of Africa's position in the world in the next 2 decades or so. You have a huge impact on how the world will be shaped. So sincerely want to thank you for your time, for your knowledge, for sharing your experience, and more importantly, for giving us some food for thought on how we should be thinking about contributing to the African continent. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and you're very kind. And we'll see if I'm right about any of this.
You're definitely right. You're definitely right. 100%.
Yeah.
It's always all the stats show that, and I think we're just at an inflection point. So it's right to share that.
No, yeah. I think I think the history is so important because I don't know, like I don't know if you're still recording or not, but I guess you are. But I spend a lot of time like at African universities, and I meet with students, things like that. And let me just close with this anecdote, which is I was at KNUST in Kumasi, Ghana, so Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, a really top engineering school, of course, in Ghana, the top engineering school, and across Africa, very, very well regarded, and really bright students. And so I'm in a room with a big group of students. Most of them are in engineering and science field. And I asked the group why they think it's important for students from a place like MIT to come and get exposure to Ghana. And their responses were very like, they're here to help us. They're here, so, we can learn things from them, right? That's immediately where their mind went, right? And I guess what's key is that like these young people start seeing themselves as like global players and not just like people that are wallowing in some country somewhere that no one's paying attention to. Their role and their importance is much bigger than that, and I want them to basically have that sense of themselves. And so what I told them is like essentially that it's like it's interesting that you're saying that because this is actually why we're doing it. And there's an example of a company that we've had a student work at in Ghana called Yamachi, which is a cancer research company that's using African genetic data to do drug discovery. And, the example is a very good one because when you take more and more, because of the diversity of the genetics on the African continent and the fact that people, evolved here and then essentially spread throughout the world, but originating in Africa. You have such high degree of genetic diversity so that when you use more and more genetic population data to create like therapeutics, you are actually creating better products.
Yep.
By being in Africa, by being very focused in Africa, you are creating better products for the whole world. That was sort of like what I wanted to see, like, see yourselves as part of the solution here. Don't, you know, what you do is very consequential and it matters. And we like, basically, we can't wait to see what it is.
That's powerful. That's powerful. A good way to close. Thank you so much, Ari. That's a very powerful way to end. For all Africans listening, African Americans, people passionate about Africa, the Africans on the continent have a huge role to play in the solution for the global prosperity, innovation, and everything in between. So thank you so much, Ari. And
yeah, appreciate it.
Appreciate your time. And to all our listeners, Ari is the managing director of MIT Africa program. As I've heard the amazing things he's doing, and hopefully you follow up. We'll have a subscription link. You can subscribe to the newsletter. Ari is also on LinkedIn, so you can check out his LinkedIn. I don't know if you can reach out to him, but we'll just you can always look up the amazing work he does through the newsletter that you can subscribe to. So thank you so much again, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for having me. I hope I had something good to share.
Of course. Thank you, guys.